"That's where you'll be sleeping tonight," my son Richard said, tossing a threadbare blanket onto the concrete floor of his freezing garage on Christmas Eve. His wife Jessica smirked behind him, whispering loud enough for me to hear. At her age, she should be grateful we're letting her stay at all. My arthritic fingers trembled as I nodded silently, the humiliation burning hotter than any tears I refused to shed. The next morning, while they were still sleeping, I called Martin, my attorney of 30 years, and initiated the process to secretly purchase the house Richard had been renting for the past 5 years. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. What my son didn't realize was that the financially struggling widow he'd been condescending to for years had built a real estate empire worth millions since his father died. I spent that freezing night huddled against my suitcase, using my coat as a pillow on the oil-stained concrete. The space heater Richard reluctantly plugged in barely took the edge off the December chill. Through the thin walls, I could hear their laughter, the clinking of wine glasses, the Christmas music that should have included me. I'd driven 6 hours after Richard's sudden invitation, the first in 3 years, only to be relegated to the garage because the guest room was supposedly being renovated. The half-empty paint can and single drop cloth I glimpsed when passing the perfectly functional room told me all I needed to know about that lie. At 72, I had mastered the art of appearing fragile and dependent. My shoulders hunched forward automatically when Richard entered a room, a posture I'd adopted to prevent his criticisms about me trying to dominate conversations. My voice softened to near whispers around him. My opinions became questions. My needs became apologies. It was a performance I'd perfected after his father died 15 years ago, when Richard's true nature emerged from beneath the shadow of my husband's authority. But this night was different. Something inside me finally snapped. Not just the indignity of the garage floor, but the culmination of 1,000 small humiliations. Richard's recent demand for another loan to cover his son's private school tuition while he and Jessica vacationed in Europe. The canceled dinner plans whenever I visited the city. The way Jessica had accidentally excluded me from Sophie's honors ceremony last spring. The garage was merely the final insult, the visible manifestation of how little they truly valued me. Dawn came with blessed relief. I waited until the house was silent before slipping inside to use the bathroom, catching my reflection in the mirror. Gray hair disheveled, eyes red-rimmed, a stranger looking back at me. I straightened momentarily before catching myself and resuming my habitual stoop. "Not yet, not time yet," Martin answered on the first ring despite the holiday. "Eleanor, is everything all right?" "I need to make a purchase," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in years. "Richard's house, but Richard doesn't own." "I know. I want to buy it from his landlord." The silence on the other end lasted only seconds before Martin's knowing chuckle filled the line. "I'll make some calls. Peterson owns that property, doesn't he? We played golf last summer." "Yes. Offer him 20% above market value for a quick, quiet sale." "Eleanor, are you sure about this?" I watched through the kitchen window as Richard and Jessica slept late while their children opened the presents I'd brought. Expensive electronics, purchased with the money Richard believed I barely scraped by on. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." "The purchase agreement is ready for your signature," Martin announced 6 weeks later, sliding the property documents across his desk. My fingers, no longer trembling, traced the embossed letterhead as a smile spread across my face. The weight that had pressed upon my shoulders for 15 years lifted slightly, allowing me to sit a little straighter in my chair. "How soon after closing can we deliver the notice?" I asked, surprising myself with the eagerness in my voice. "The closing process will take another 8 weeks, Eleanor. Real estate transactions aren't instantaneous, especially with a property of this value," Martin explained gently. "But once the deed is in your name, we can issue the non-renewal notice immediately. With their lease expiring in 4 months, the timing works in our favor." I nodded, tempering my impatience. "And there's no way Richard can find out during this process?" "Not unless Peterson tells him, which he has no reason to do. He's happy with the above-market offer, and our confidentiality clause comes with significant penalties." Martin leaned forward, concern creasing his brow. "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this, Eleanor? It will change your relationship with Richard permanently." I thought about Christmas Eve on the garage floor, about the loans Richard had extracted from me for years, money that had furnished that house, paid for vacations, and funded his children's education while he boasted about his business acumen. About Jessica's whispered insults and rolling eyes whenever I spoke. About my granddaughter Sophie's confusion when I was suddenly uninvited from her high school graduation after years of being her most devoted supporter. The relationship already changed, Martin. I'm just the only one who noticed. The hotel suite I'd been staying in since Christmas felt more like home than any place I'd lived since selling my house 3 years ago, supposedly to downsize appropriately, but really because Richard had convinced me I couldn't manage the property anymore. The lie had served its purpose. I'd appeared to struggle financially while my investments multiplied under Martin's expert management, hidden from my son's grasping hands. How exactly have you managed to keep your financial situation from Richard all these years? Martin asked, voicing a question I could see had puzzled him for some time. I smiled wryly. James set it up before he died. He always saw through Richard's entitlement, even when I was still making excuses for it. He established the separate accounts, the investment vehicles, everything structured so Richard would only see what we wanted him to see. And the loans? Calculated. Always just enough to maintain the illusion that I was living on a modest widow's pension while still having a little to sacrifice for my son. I shook my head at my own complicity. I transferred the money from my visible accounts, the ones Richard has casually helped me manage over the years. Meanwhile, the real assets remained untouched, growing steadily. Martin nodded with newfound understanding. And Richard never questioned where the money for these loans came from if you were supposedly struggling? People rarely question narratives that benefit them, Martin. Richard chose to believe I was depleting my meager savings out of maternal love rather than consider I might have resources he couldn't access. That evening, I ordered room service instead of eating the bland, low-sodium meals I pretended to prefer around Richard. I sat at the elegant desk in my suite and wrote 2 letters, one to my younger son Thomas, who had moved overseas years ago to escape his brother's toxic presence, and another to my granddaughter Sophie, now in her first year of college, paid for by me, though Richard claimed credit. I called the hotel salon and booked an appointment for the following morning, my first professional haircut in years. Jessica had convinced Richard that I wasted money on such frivolities, insisting her occasional kitchen scissor trims were perfectly adequate for someone your age. When I hung up the phone, I caught my reflection in the mirror again. This time, I didn't hunch. I stood tall, shoulders back, chin lifted. A stranger looked back at me. No, not a stranger. Someone I had almost forgotten. The woman I used to be. There must be some mistake, Richard sputtered, waving the formal notice in my face as I sat calmly at the cafe where I'd invited him for coffee. The property sale had finally closed after 14 weeks of paperwork, inspections, and legal reviews. The moment the deed was officially recorded, Martin had delivered the non-renewal notice to Richard's door. His face had flushed an alarming shade of red the moment he recognized Martin's letterhead. This says, "You're our new landlord, and we have to move out when our lease expires in 2 months. That's impossible." I took a deliberate sip of my latte, full fat, not the skim milk I'd pretended to prefer around him. "It's not a mistake, Richard. I purchased the house from Mr. Peterson last month. But you can't afford..." His voice trailed off as realization dawned. "How long have you been lying to me about your finances?" The cafe's ambient noise faded as I leaned forward. My newly styled silver hair fell in an elegant bob that framed my face, catching the sunlight streaming through the windows. "About as long as you've been lying to me about yours," I replied, my voice steady. "Those business emergencies that required immediate loans, the investments that always mysteriously failed, the renovations to a house you didn't even own." His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for water. "You've been keeping track?" From my purse, I withdrew a small leather-bound notebook and placed it on the table between us. Every penny, every date, every promise to repay. 15 years' worth. Richard's eyes narrowed as his initial shock gave way to calculation. "You're my mother. You wanted to help me. That's what mothers do." "Yes, we do," I agreed, meeting his gaze without flinching. "We help our children grow into responsible, respectful adults. I failed you in that regard, and I'm correcting my mistake. By making us homeless?" His voice rose, drawing glances from nearby tables. "By giving you consequences," I corrected. "You have 2 months to find a new place. The tenant laws are quite clear. And since your lease was already set to expire, there's no legal recourse. But where are we supposed to go on such short notice? The kids are in school. Jessica has her social commitments. You can't just upend our lives because you're suddenly feeling vindictive." "I spoke with an attorney who specializes in tenant rights," I replied calmly. 2 months is the standard notice period when a lease is not being renewed. If anything, I've been more generous than legally required. Richard's face darkened. Dad would be ashamed of you, he hissed, playing his final card. I laughed then, a real laugh that startled both of us. Your father knew exactly who I was. Richard, it's you who never bothered to find out. I stood, dropping cash on the table to cover both our drinks. I'll expect the property vacated by June 15th. Martin will conduct the final walkthrough. As I walked away, my back straight and my head high, I heard him call after me. Jessica will never forgive you for this. I didn't turn around, but my voice carried clearly over my shoulder. That might be the first gift she's ever given me. I cannot believe you're doing this to your own family. Jessica's voice crackled through my phone a week later. After everything we've done for you, like making me sleep in the garage at Christmas, I interrupted, something I never would have done 3 months ago. The silence that followed was deeply satisfying. I continued unpacking books in my new apartment, a luxury high-rise downtown that I'd purchased outright last week. Or perhaps you meant the time you told Sophie I was too sick to attend her graduation when I was perfectly healthy. Richard told me you weren't feeling well enough. Please don't insult my intelligence on top of everything else. Jessica, I placed a framed photo of Sophie on my new bookshelf. I've already spoken with Sophie and explained everything. She'll be visiting me during her spring break next week. What do you mean you've explained everything? Jessica's voice held a note of panic. The truth, Jessica, about who's really been paying her tuition all these years. About the graduation. About Christmas Eve. How would she even know about the tuition? Richard set up all those payments through his account. I smiled, though Jessica couldn't see it. Sophie is a bright young woman who became curious after receiving an automated email from the university's financial system. It seems when Richard changed the payment method last semester to make it appear the funds were coming from him, he forgot to update the notification settings. Sophie received a confirmation that showed the previous direct deposits from my account dating back to her freshman year. Another long silence. Then, what exactly are you hoping to accomplish with all this vindictiveness? I sat on my plush new sofa, admiring the view of the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. I'm reclaiming my life. The fact that it inconveniences yours is merely a bonus. We'll fight this, she threatened. We'll get a lawyer. I welcome it, I replied calmly. Discovery would be fascinating. All those joint accounts where my loans mysteriously appeared, the financial documents Richard had me sign when my arthritis was at its worst and I couldn't read the fine print, the power of attorney forms he's been trying to get me to sign for years. The sharp intake of breath told me I'd hit my mark. You've changed, she accused. No, Jessica, I've remembered. There's a difference. I ended the call and returned to my unpacking. That evening, I met Martin for dinner at an upscale restaurant I'd never have dared visit when maintaining my facade of genteel poverty. Over aged scotch, another preference I'd hidden, we discussed my next steps. The renovations to the house can begin as soon as they vacate, Martin confirmed. I've already contacted the designer you recommended, and the initial paperwork for the foundation concept is being drafted, though you should know that establishing a formal nonprofit will take at least 6 to 8 months for IRS approval, and probably a full year before it's fully operational. That's fine, I nodded. We can use the time to develop the programs properly. I want this to be more than just revenge, Martin. I want to create something meaningful. And the audit of Richard's business? Martin's expression turned grave. You found something. I did. After you mentioned your concerns about his company's financial statements, I had my colleague Sarah, she specializes in forensic accounting, take a discreet look. He's been using your investments as collateral for loans. If he doesn't find new funding within 90 days, he'll face bankruptcy. Instead of the guilt I might have felt before, I experienced only clarity. He'll come asking for money again, without doubt, and I'll refuse, also without doubt. Martin smiled, raising his glass in a toast. To reclamation. I clinked my glass against his. To consequences. Later that night, I received a text from Sophie confirming her visit. The genuine excitement in her message warmed me in ways Richard's manipulations had made me forget was possible. I fell asleep without needing the sleeping pills Richard had insisted were necessary for women your age. Another small freedom reclaimed. Grandma, you look amazing, Sophie exclaimed, embracing me in the lobby of my apartment building. Her genuine surprise made me realize how dramatically I'd transformed in the 3 months since Christmas. My new hairstyle, tailored clothes, and, most significantly, upright posture presented a woman even I was still getting to know. Thank you, darling, So do you. I held her at arm's length, noting the shadows under her eyes and slight weight loss, though I suspect we both have stories to tell. Over lunch in my apartment, Sophie's story poured out. The tension at home since my betrayal, Richard's increasingly desperate business maneuvers, Jessica's social withdrawal as friends discovered their financial facade was crumbling. Dad keeps saying you've lost your mind, that we need to protect you from yourself. Sophie's fingers nervously shredded her napkin. He and Mom have been meeting with lawyers about something called conservatorship. I nodded, unsurprised. Martin warned me they might try something like that. That's why I've already undergone comprehensive cognitive and psychological evaluations. I reached for a folder on my coffee table and handed it to her. 3 separate specialists have certified that I'm completely competent. Sophie's relief was palpable. I knew you weren't crazy. I just couldn't understand why you suddenly changed so much. Not changed, Sophie. Revealed. I took her hands in mine. Your grandfather protected me from your father's nature while he was alive. After he died, I chose to protect myself by becoming invisible, the doddering old woman Richard could control and dismiss. But why? You're so strong. Because I was afraid of losing you, I admitted, vulnerability seeping into my voice for the first time in our conversation. Richard made it clear that my relationship with you depended on my compliance. Sophie's eyes widened. The missed birthdays, the canceled visits, all Richard's orchestration. Yes, her face hardened in a way that reminded me painfully of her father. What are you going to do about their conservatorship plans? I smiled. I've already done it. As of yesterday, your Uncle Thomas has medical power of attorney should I become incapacitated, and Martin has financial power of attorney, with Thomas as backup. Dad will be furious. Dad will be irrelevant, I corrected gently. Now, there's something else you should know. I've updated my will and estate plan. Sophie shook her head. I don't care about money, Grandma. I know you don't, darling, but you should understand what's happening. I withdrew another folder from my desk. The new will includes what I'm calling a behavioral adjustment clause. For each documented instance of disrespect, manipulation, or financial exploitation, Richard's share of the inheritance decreases according to a specific formula. Sophie's eyes widened. Can you really do that? It's completely legal, I assured her. Martin had it reviewed by 2 estate specialists. Your father can contest it after I'm gone, of course, but the documentation we've assembled would make that an uphill battle. Does Dad know about this? Not yet, but he will. I closed the folder. Now, enough about that. Tell me about your classes. As Sophie described her studies, I noticed her animation returning. By the time she left that evening, her shoulders had straightened too, a small mirror of my own transformation. She hugged me fiercely at the door. I'm so proud of you, Grandma. Those words, from that beloved face, were worth every moment of the past 15 years. The following morning, Richard appeared unannounced at my apartment, his usual polished appearance noticeably frayed. Whatever you told Sophie, she's not answering our calls, he accused without preamble. I stepped aside to let him enter, noting how he automatically examined my apartment, assessing its value. I told her the truth, Richard, something you might try sometime. This vendetta has gone far enough, he snapped. The business is suffering because I'm dealing with your crisis. My awakening is not a crisis, I corrected, gesturing for him to sit. When he remained standing, I shrugged and took a seat myself. And your business is suffering because you've mismanaged funds for years. His face paled. What do you know about my business? Everything. The audit was quite thorough. For the first time since I'd known him, Richard seemed genuinely afraid. Good. Mrs. Winters, the renovations look absolutely magnificent, the interior designer gushed as we walked through the transformed house, Richard's former home. Now mine in truth as well as title. The 2 months had passed, and despite legal threats and one drunken late-night banging on my apartment door, Richard and Jessica had finally vacated the property. I trailed my fingers along the new kitchen countertops. Italian marble, not the cheap granite Jessica had boasted about at every opportunity. Thank you, Claudia. You've captured exactly what I envisioned. Will you be moving in yourself? She asked, making notes on her tablet. No, I smiled at her surprise. This house will become the headquarters for what will eventually be the Winters Foundation for Elder Dignity. I've begun the incorporation process, though it will take 6 to 8 months for the nonprofit status to be approved by the IRS. In the meantime, we can use the space to start developing our programs. What exactly will the foundation do? Claudia asked, her professional interest clearly piqued. It will provide resources and support for seniors experiencing financial abuse, particularly from family members. The main floor will eventually be offices, and the upper floor will provide temporary housing for seniors transitioning out of abusive living situations. Claudia's professional veneer cracked slightly. That's wonderful. My own grandmother suffered financial abuse from my uncle for years before anyone realized. It's more common than people think, I replied, moving to the large front windows. From here, I could see the garden where Sophie had played as a child, where Richard had hosted barbecues for business associates while I washed dishes in the kitchen. The doorbell interrupted my thoughts. That would be Martin with the incorporation paperwork, I told Claudia. Would you excuse me? But when I opened the door, I found Jessica standing on the porch, noticeably thinner and less polished than I remembered. Her eyes widened as she took in my appearance. The elegant linen dress, the subtle makeup, the straight posture that made me seem taller than she recalled. Eleanor, she said stiffly, I need to speak with you. I hesitated only briefly before stepping back to allow her entry. Her sharp intake of breath as she saw the renovated interior gave me a satisfaction I didn't try to hide. You've been busy, she observed, trailing her hand along the wall where her cherished family portraits had once hung, now replaced by serene landscapes. Indeed, I led her to the living room, now furnished with comfortable but elegant seating, arranged in a conversational circle rather than all facing the massive television Richard had insisted was the room's natural focal point. Jessica remained standing, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. Richard doesn't know I'm here. I gathered as much. She took a deep breath. I need to ask, what will it take to end this? Name your price. I laughed softly. Jessica, you still don't understand. This isn't a negotiation. It's a consequence. People are talking, she hissed. Our friends, our club members. Everyone knows Richard's business is struggling, that we had to downsize to that awful apartment, that Sophie barely speaks to us. And you blame me for those consequences, rather than the actions that led to them. I shook my head. That's why this needed to happen. You're enjoying this? She accused. I considered her words carefully before answering. Yes, I admitted finally. I am enjoying my freedom, my reclaimed dignity, and the ability to use my resources as I choose. If that includes watching you and Richard experience the natural results of your choices, then yes, I'm enjoying that too. Jessica's carefully maintained facade cracked. You've destroyed our lives out of spite. No, Jessica. I simply stopped enabling the destruction of mine. I stood, signaling the end of our conversation. Now, unless you're here to volunteer for the foundation, I have work to do. As she stormed out, I noticed Claudia watching from the hallway with unconcealed admiration. Mrs. Winters, forgive me for eavesdropping, but that was magnificent. For the first time in decades, I felt the full power of my own smile. Thank you, Claudia. It rather was, wasn't it? The incorporation papers are officially filed, Martin announced, sliding the documents across the conference table in what had once been Richard's dining room. 8 months had passed since I'd reclaimed the house, and the groundwork for the Winters Foundation for Elder Dignity was steadily progressing. The IRS review for nonprofit status typically takes another 4 to 6 months, but we can begin limited operations in the meantime. Excellent news, I replied, scanning the legal language that would eventually allow us to help others who had experienced what I had. And the website development? On schedule. They'll need final approval on content next month, but the structure is in place. There's something else you should know, Martin added, his expression carefully neutral. Richard's business filed for bankruptcy protection yesterday. I set down the paperwork, absorbing this information. I see. He's telling people you sabotaged him. Of course he is. I smiled wryly. Heaven forbid he accept responsibility for leveraging non-existent assets. Martin studied me carefully. Are you all right? Surprisingly, yes. And I was. The guilt I might have felt even 3 months ago was notably absent. Has he approached you about accessing his trust fund early? Last week, I reminded him of the conditions his father set. He can't touch the principal until he's 60, unless it's for education or medical emergencies. I nodded, remembering my husband's foresight. James had recognized Richard's financial irresponsibility long before I had admitted it to myself. And Sophie? Her separate trust remains secure and untouched. Thomas is the trustee now, as you arranged. Good. I gathered the foundation papers, ready to move on. Let's continue our planning for the pilot programs. I'd like to have something in place even before the official nonprofit status is approved. That evening, as I reviewed potential program structures, my phone rang with Thomas's overseas number. My younger son had been supportive, but cautious about my transformation. worried from afar that it might be some kind of delayed grief response rather than a genuine reclamation. "Mom, I just saw the Foundation website preview. It's incredible," he said by way of greeting. "Thank you, darling. I'm rather proud of it myself. Richard called me," he continued, his tone shifting. "He's not well." I sat at my vanity, meeting my own eyes in the mirror as I held the phone. Define not well. Drinking too much. Blaming everyone but himself. Jessica's left him. Did you know? No, I didn't. This genuinely surprised me. Jessica had always seemed so committed to the lifestyle Richard provided. When? Last week, apparently. She's moved in with her sister in Phoenix. I processed this information, searching for the sympathy I should probably feel. It existed, but distantly, like looking at a sad scene in a film rather than experiencing it personally. "Has he asked you for money yet?" Thomas's bitter laugh answered before his words did. Within the first 3 minutes of the call, I refused. Good. Pride in my younger son's boundaries warmed my voice. "Mom," Thomas said hesitantly, "I'm thinking of coming home for a visit. To see you, the foundation, everything you've built." Tears sprang unexpectedly to my eyes. "I'd like that very much. And if Richard reaches out to you?" Thomas trailed off. I straightened my shoulders, meeting my reflection's steady gaze. "If Richard reaches out, he'll find I'm no longer the mother he could manipulate, but I am still his mother, for whatever that's worth to him now." After we hung up, I returned to my planning documents, noting with satisfaction how the Foundation's vision, still months from full implementation, was already beginning to take tangible form. My new will with its behavioral adjustment clause remained securely filed with Martin, a silent reminder that consequences could extend even beyond my lifetime. The woman in the mirror nodded approvingly at my choices, both sartorial and existential. She and I were finally becoming the same person again. "You can't just ignore me forever, Mother." Richard's voice slurred slightly as he confronted me outside the house that was now the developing Foundation headquarters. 10 months had passed since Christmas Eve in the garage, and this was our first face-to-face encounter since his business collapsed. His once immaculate appearance had deteriorated. Rumpled clothes, unkempt hair, the bloated features of consistent drinking. "I'm not ignoring you, Richard. I'm establishing boundaries." I unlocked the office door, allowing him to follow me inside. The early morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating the space that had once been his living room, now transformed into a reception area for our future clients. "State your purpose." He blinked, unaccustomed to my directness. I need help." "Financial help, I presume." His jaw tightened. "You know exactly what position I'm in. My business is gone. Jessica left. Even Sophie barely speaks to me. And you believe these are problems I should solve for you?" I set my purse on the reception desk, watching him steadily. "You're my mother," he said, as if this explained and excused everything. "Yes, I am. Which is why I'm going to offer you something more valuable than money." I gestured to the chairs in the waiting area. "Please, sit." Suspicion clouded his features, but desperation won out. He sat, and I took the chair opposite him rather than retreating behind the authority of a desk. "I'm offering you redemption, Richard, not rescue. There's a difference." "What the hell does that mean?" His voice rose in frustration. "It means I'll help you rebuild your life, but not your illusions." I held his gaze without flinching. "You can work here at the Foundation, starting at the bottom. Minimum wage, answering phones, making coffee, filing paperwork. You'll attend therapy twice weekly. You'll enroll in financial literacy classes. You'll earn back trust and self-respect through consistent effort." He stared at me, incredulous. "You expect me to be your servant?" "I expect you to be accountable, for perhaps the first time in your adult life." Richard leaped to his feet, anger displacing his initial supplication. "This is your idea of maternal love? Public humiliation?" I remained seated, unruffled by his outburst. "No, Richard. This is my idea of respect, treating you as an adult capable of growth rather than a child entitled to bailouts." "Keep your damn charity," he spat, moving toward the door. "Thomas will help me. He understands family loyalty." "Thomas has already refused you," I replied calmly, "as has your father's brother, your former business partners, and Jessica's family. My offer remains open, but it's the only one you'll get from me." He froze with his hand on the doorknob, reality finally penetrating his self-righteous anger. When he turned back, something had shifted in his expression, the first crack in decades of entitlement. "When would I start?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Monday, 8 a.m. I stood, reclaiming the full height I'd denied myself for years. "Don't be late." After he left, I called Martin. Richard's going to accept the foundation position, I told him. Are you sure that's wise? Martin's concern was evident. Given your history? No, I admitted. But it's necessary, for both of us. And remember, the foundation won't be fully operational for several more months. This gives us time to see if he's genuinely willing to change or just temporarily desperate. And if it's the latter, then the behavioral adjustment clause in my will comes into play. Richard needs to understand that actions have consequences, both negative and positive, even after I'm gone. That night, I sat on my apartment balcony watching the city lights, reflecting on the strange circularity of life. I had spent decades diminishing myself to protect Richard from consequences. Now, I was offering him consequences as the only remaining way to truly help him. My phone chimed with a text from Sophie. Dad told me about the job offer. Thank you for not giving up on him, Grandma. I smiled, typing back. I haven't given up on him. I've simply stopped enabling him. There's a world of difference. Mr. Winters, the Collins file needs to be updated before the meeting, I instructed Richard as I passed the reception desk where he'd been working for the past 3 months. His initial resentment had gradually given way to a grudging competence, though true change would require much more time, if it happened at all. Our foundation was now in its 14th month of development, with the IRS nonprofit determination letter finally received last week. Already done, Mrs. Winters, he replied, the formality we maintained during office hours still awkward but increasingly natural. And Mrs. Abernathy called to confirm her appointment this afternoon. I nodded approvingly. Thank you. Our professional detachment dissolved each Tuesday and Thursday evening during our mandatory therapy sessions, the only condition of his employment that Richard had initially tried to reject. Those sessions had become a battlefield, then a confessional, and finally, tentatively, a bridge across decades of misunderstanding. Mom, he called as I reached my office door, the personal address signaling a shift in our conversation. Sophie mentioned she's bringing someone to Thanksgiving dinner. A boyfriend? I turned, noting the genuine interest in his question rather than the possessive concern he would have exhibited a year ago. Yes, his name is Marcus. He's studying engineering with her. Richard nodded, absorbing this information about the daughter who was slowly allowing him back into her life. Would it be appropriate if I brought something? A dessert, maybe? The hesitation in his voice, this new humility that therapy was painfully extracting from him, touched me unexpectedly. Pumpkin pie would be welcome. Sophie still loves it. The smile that briefly illuminated his face carried echoes of the boy he'd been before wealth and entitlement had corrupted him. The son I'd loved unreservedly before fear and manipulation had complicated that love. Later that afternoon, I met with Mrs. Abernathy, an 80-year-old widow whose children had been systematically depleting her savings while isolating her from friends who might notice. Her situation reflected my own former vulnerability, though her children's methods had been more overtly criminal than Richard's emotional manipulation. I was so ashamed, she confessed, twisting her wedding ring, the one possession her daughter hadn't managed to borrow yet. I raised them better than this. The shame belongs to them, not you, I assured her, the words I'd repeated to countless clients, now carrying the weight of my own experience. Loving your children doesn't mean surrendering your dignity. As we discussed legal options and temporary housing in the foundation's upstairs apartments, I caught sight of Richard through my office window. He was helping an elderly gentleman with a walker navigate the front steps, his manner patient and attentive. The sight gave me a complicated hope, not the blind maternal optimism I'd once clung to, but a cautious recognition of genuine effort. That evening, as I prepared to leave, Richard appeared in my office doorway. I've been thinking, he began, uncharacteristic uncertainty in his voice. The East Wing renovations you're planning for the expanded counseling center. Yes, I prompted when he hesitated. My old business partner, Daniel, he's still in construction. He'd probably give you a good rate, and his work is excellent. He shrugged awkwardly. Just a thought. I considered him for a long moment. This small offering, a useful connection without any apparent benefit to himself, represented a subtle but significant shift in our dynamic. Thank you, Richard. I'll consider it. He nodded and turned to go, then paused. Mom, I know it doesn't fix anything, but I'm sorry about Christmas Eve, about the garage, about all of it. The apology hung between us, inadequate but sincere, like the man himself. I know, I replied simply. As he left, I remained at my desk, reflecting on our journey. The foundation had begun helping seniors reclaim their autonomy, though we were still in the early stages. Sophie was flourishing at college. Thomas was planning his second visit home in 15 years. And Richard was taking his first stumbling steps toward becoming someone who might, eventually, be worthy of forgiveness. Not yet, but someday, perhaps. I straightened papers that didn't need straightening, my hands no longer trembling with suppressed anger or fear. The woman I glimpsed in my office window's reflection stood tall, her gaze direct, her boundaries firm. She nodded at me in silent acknowledgement of how far we'd come together. This stranger who was becoming familiar again, this self I was reclaiming one day at a time. I pulled out the newest version of my will, reviewing once more the behavioral adjustment clause. With each month of Richard's genuine effort, the penalties decreased slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of progress without naive forgiveness. Consequences and redemption, carefully balanced. To the Winters Foundation's official launch, Martin proposed, raising his champagne glass in the elegantly decorated ballroom. Around us, 200 guests, donors, clients, community leaders, and family echoed the toast. 18 months had passed since that Christmas Eve in the garage, and after extensive planning, legal filings, and program development, we were finally fully operational. I smiled, surveying the gathering with pride. In our soft launch phase, we had already provided housing for 7 seniors transitioning out of abusive situations, legal assistance for dozens more, and educational workshops that had reached hundreds of community members. Across the room, Sophie stood with Marcus, her boyfriend of 6 months now, both of them engaged in animated conversation with Thomas, who had finally moved back to the States to join the Foundation's board of directors. Nearby, Richard stood slightly apart, his 1-year sobriety chip visible on the chain around his neck. His position at the Foundation had evolved from basic reception work to coordinating our volunteer program. His business experience finally channeled into something constructive. Jessica had not been invited. Her bitter social media campaign against me had fizzled when former friends chose sides, most of them discovering they preferred my authentic self to her carefully constructed facade. "Eleanor," a warm voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned to find Claudia, the interior designer who had transformed Richard's house into the Foundation headquarters. "Everything looks magnificent." "Thank you for coming," I replied, genuinely pleased to see her. "And for bringing Mrs. Chen." I nodded toward the elderly woman Claudia had escorted to the event, her grandmother, who had inspired Claudia's enthusiasm for our mission. She wouldn't miss it. "Your story gave her courage to finally confront my uncle about the financial control he's maintained since my grandfather died." I squeezed her hand. "I'm glad to hear it. That's exactly why we're here." As Claudia moved on to greet other guests, I found myself face to face with Richard. The year had changed him physically. Sobriety had sharpened his features. Therapy had softened his expression, and manual labor on our recent building expansion had strengthened his once soft body. "Quite a turnout," he observed, his eyes scanning the crowd with none of the calculating assessment he would have shown a year ago. "You've built something remarkable, Mom." "We've built something worthwhile," I corrected, acknowledging his contributions without absolving the past. Our relationship remained a work in progress, formal during Foundation hours, cautiously personal during family gatherings, raw and honest during our continuing therapy sessions. Richard nodded, accepting the measured inclusion. "Sophie told me she's bringing Marcus home for Christmas." "Yes, it's getting serious between them." I watched my granddaughter across the room, her happiness a balm for all the difficult months. Will you be joining us for Christmas Eve?" Richard asked, the question revealing both how far we'd come and how much remained unresolved. I met his gaze directly. "No, Richard, I don't think I'm ready for that yet." He accepted this boundary with a nod, disappointment evident, but no manipulation attempted. "I understand. Perhaps New Year's Day lunch instead?" "Perhaps," I allowed, neither committing nor refusing. Our conversation was interrupted by the event coordinator signaling it was time for my speech. As I moved toward the podium, my posture straight and confident, I felt the weight of all the eyes upon me, supportive, curious, assessing. A year ago, such attention would have terrified me into hunched invisibility. Now I welcomed it. "Good evening," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the room without hesitation. 18 months ago, I spent Christmas Eve sleeping on a concrete garage floor. The story unfolded from my lips without shame or bitterness. The humiliation transformed into purpose, the pain into action. As I spoke, I watched understanding dawn on faces that had never known my previous self, recognition flicker in eyes that had witnessed my transformation. The Winters Foundation exists because dignity should never be sacrificed for family peace, I concluded. Because financial security should never require emotional submission. Because it's never too late to reclaim your power. I didn't mention the behavioral adjustment clause in my will, though it remained active. Richard's progress was encouraging but incomplete. His tendency toward manipulation emerging occasionally in therapy, his entitlement surfacing in moments of stress. The clause remained as both incentive and protection, a silent guardian of the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. The applause that followed wasn't just for the Foundation's accomplishments, but for the journey they represented. My journey from invisibility to influence, from submission to strength. Later, as guests began to depart, Thomas approached with Sophie. "Mom, that was incredible," he said, embracing me. "Dad would have been so proud." I returned his embrace, knowing he meant my husband, not his brother. "Thank you, darling." Sophie hugged me next, whispering, "You're my hero, Grandma," before pulling away with suspiciously bright eyes. As they moved toward the door, Richard appeared at my side again. "They're right, you know," he said quietly. "What you've done is extraordinary." I turned to face my eldest son, this man who had caused me such pain and who was now struggling toward redemption. "What we do next will be the true measure," I replied. He nodded, understanding the challenge embedded in my words. "I'll see you Monday morning, Mrs. Winters." 8 o'clock sharp, Mr. Winters, I confirmed, maintaining the professional boundary that now defined our weekday interactions. After everyone had gone, I stood alone in the ballroom, champagne glass still in hand. The woman reflected in the mirrored wall opposite me stood tall and uncompromising, her eyes clear, her purpose evident in every line of her body. "We did it," I whispered to her, and she smiled back, no longer a stranger but a hard-won friend. "I brought your coffee, Mrs. Winters," Richard said, placing the mug on my desk exactly as I preferred it. 1 cream, no sugar, in the blue ceramic mug Sophie had given me for my 73rd birthday. Exactly 1 year had passed since that Christmas Eve in the garage, a full circle of seasons and transformations. "Thank you, Mr. Winters." I accepted the coffee, noting the ease that had gradually developed in our professional interactions. The Foundation now employed 15 people full-time, with Richard serving as volunteer coordinator, a role that suited his networking skills without giving him financial authority. He hesitated at the door. Sophie called. "She and Marcus will arrive around 4 today. Thomas is picking them up at the airport." I nodded, the reminder warming me. "Perfect. Dinner reservations are at 7. The invitation for Christmas Eve dinner had been Sophie's idea. Neutral ground at an upscale restaurant downtown, with clear beginning and end times to prevent the emotional spillover that still occasionally erupted between Richard and me during unstructured family time. "Mom," Richard said, the personal address signaling a shift in our conversation. "I wanted to give you something before tonight." He placed a small wrapped package on my desk, then stepped back, hands clasped behind him in the posture he'd adopted during particularly vulnerable therapy sessions. I unwrapped it carefully, revealing a framed photograph I hadn't seen in years. My husband James and me on our 30th anniversary, my posture confident, my smile genuine, his arm around me protectively but not possessively. "I found it when I was clearing out my storage unit last month," Richard explained. "It seemed like it should be yours." I traced the glass over James's face, remembering the man who had loved my strength rather than fearing it. "Thank you," I said simply. Richard nodded, accepting the limited response that defined our healing, genuine but cautious, advancing without overreaching. "I'll see you tonight," he said, returning to the professional demeanor that structured our daytime interactions. After he left, I placed the photograph on my desk beside the more recent images: Sophie's graduation, Thomas's return celebration, the Foundation's ribbon-cutting ceremony, a visual timeline of reclamation. I opened my desk drawer and removed the latest revision of my will. The behavioral adjustment clause remained, though modified to acknowledge Richard's progress. The specifics were clear: continued sobriety, ongoing therapy, and demonstrated respect for boundaries would gradually restore his inheritance rights, not as manipulation, but as recognition of genuine change. The document represented both accountability and possibility, the balance I had struggled to find in our relationship. That evening, as we gathered at the restaurant, Sophie and Marcus, Thomas and his new boyfriend David, Richard and I observed the careful dance we'd all learned. Richard's sobriety had steadied him, therapy had humbled him, and consequences had taught him what decades of enabling never could. Yet his transformation remained a work in progress, authentic in many moments, performative in others. The journey would likely continue long after this symbolic anniversary. "Before we order," Sophie announced, holding Marcus's hand tightly, "we have some news." The engagement ring caught the light as she extended her hand, triggering congratulations from around the table. Richard's eyes sought mine in shared recognition of the moment's significance. A year ago, he would have immediately attempted to control this situation, offering unwanted financial assistance that would become leverage, inserting himself into wedding plans, claiming ownership of his daughter's milestone. Instead, he simply raised his water glass. "To Sophie and Marcus, may your partnership be built on mutual respect and genuine support." The words, clearly influenced by concepts from his therapy, carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. I raised my own glass, adding, "and to boundaries that protect rather than divide." Sophie's eyes glistened with tears as she recognized the growth this exchange represented. "Thank you," she said, looking between her father and me. "That means everything." Later, as dessert arrived, Richard quietly asked, "Will you be attending the Christmas morning gathering at Thomas's tomorrow?" "Yes," I confirmed. "Sophie mentioned you'll be there as well." He nodded. "If that's comfortable for you." "It is," I said, realizing with mild surprise that I meant it. The rage that had fueled my initial transformation had gradually refined itself into something more sustainable. Not forgiveness exactly, but a clear-eyed acceptance of what was, what had been, and what might yet be. After dinner, as we prepared to part ways in the restaurant parking lot, Richard approached me one last time. "I know I can never fully make amends," he said quietly, the Christmas lights reflecting in his eyes. "But I want you to know I see you now. The real you. I'm sorry it took losing everything to finally notice. I studied my son, this flawed, struggling man who had caused me such pain and was now inching toward redemption. We're both being seen now, Richard, perhaps for the first time." He nodded, understanding the double edge of this visibility, the comfort and the accountability it demanded from both of us. "Merry Christmas, Mom," he said, not attempting the hug we weren't ready for. "Merry Christmas, Richard," I replied, my posture straight, my voice steady, my boundaries intact. As I drove home to my apartment, I caught sight of myself in the rearview mirror. Gray hair elegantly styled, shoulders squared, eyes direct and clear. No longer the woman who had huddled on a garage floor, accepting crumbs of family connection at the cost of her dignity. The garage had broken something in me, yes, but it had broken the shell, not the core. What emerged from that concrete floor wasn't a victim seeking revenge, but a woman reclaiming her power, her voice, her rightful place. The Christmas lights blurred slightly as I smiled at my reflection. This familiar stranger who had always been waiting, patient and strong, for me to remember her name. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.